Welcome back to another episode of Mike Reads. Tonight we'll be continuing in our series on Thomas Sowell's Economic Facts and Fallacies with our second read in Chapter 5. Chapter 5 is entitled Income Facts and Fallacies. Today we will be reading the section entitled Income Inequality. As I've mentioned throughout the course of this series, we are doing this series as a parallel read with Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson. So I'll put a link to that series in this video's description so you can check that out as well if you'd like. Also, as I mentioned throughout the course of this series, we'll be doing an analysis and review at the end of each read. So I'll put a timestamp in this video's description so you can jump straight to the analysis and review if that's how you'd like to go about things. Today's chapter is fairly long. And Sowell has broken up the section into several subsections. I'll let you know when we get to those subsection breaks, and I'll put those subsection breaks into the timestamp section of the comments section of this video. The other thing I have to point out is a bit of housekeeping. There are some graphs, and there are direct references in the text to the visualized versions of those graphs. So I will, in editing, put a recreation of those visual representations into this video. So if you guys are on audio only, you guys are going to have to either be following along with the book itself, or you're really going to have to use your imagination. He does make these points fairly clear, so you have to forgive me on that front. There's really no other way for me to go about this other than to recreate those visual representations in editing. So with all of that out of the way, and without any further ado, let's dive on into tonight's read, which is in Chapter 5, entitled Income Facts and Fallacies, in the section entitled Income Inequality. Ultimately, we are concerned with people rather than statistical categories, and especially our concern is with the standard of living of people. Since the affluent and the wealthy can take care of themselves, people of modest or low incomes are a special focus. Obvious as all this might seem, much ingenuity has gone into concocting statistical alarms having little or nothing to do with the standard of living of actual flesh and blood human beings. One widely quoted study, for example, used income tax data to show dramatically growing income inequality among quote-unquote tax units, leaving the impression that there was a similarly sharp increase in income inequality among human beings. Some tax units coincide with individuals, some coincide with married couples, and some coincide with neither, because some of these tax units are businesses. Comparisons among such heterogeneous categories are comparisons of apples and oranges. In some media translations of these studies, these tax units are often referred to loosely as quote-unquote families. But a couple living together and filing separate income tax returns are not two families, and to record their incomes as family incomes means artificially creating two statistical families with half the income of the real family. Tax laws changed significantly during the period when this dramatic increase in statistical inequality occurred, so that some income that had previously been taxed as business income was now being taxed as personal income, particularly at the highest income levels where business income is an especially large share of total income. In other words, money that would previously not have been counted as personal income among the highest income tax units was now counted, creating the statistical impression that there was a dramatic change in real income among real people, when in fact there was a change in definitions used when compiling statistics. This study mentioned such crucial caveats in a footnote, but that footnote was seldom, if ever, quoted in the many alarming media accounts. Just as income statistics greatly underestimate the economic resources available to people in the lower income brackets, steeply progressive income taxes substantially overestimate the actual economic resource at the disposal of the people in the upper income brackets. Most income statistics count income before taxes and leave out both cash transfers and in-kind transfers from the government. Since most of the taxes are paid by people earning above average incomes, and most of the income of people in the lowest income bracket comes from government transfers, income statistics exaggerate the differences in actual standards of living. Disparities between A and B will always be greater if you exaggerate what A has and underestimate what B has. Yet that simple fallacy underlies much of the political, media, and even academic alarm over quote-unquote disparities and quote-unquote inequalities. Concern over poverty is often confused with concern over differences in income, as if the wealth of the wealthy derives from and is the reason for the poverty of the poor. But this is just one of the many forms of the zero-sum fallacy. Since the United States contains several times as many billionaires as any other country, ordinary Americans would be among the most poverty-stricken people in the world if the wealth of the wealthy derives from the poverty of the poor. Conversely, billionaires are much rarer in the most poverty-stricken parts of the world. Some people have tried to salvage the zero-sum view by claiming that wealthy people in wealthy countries exploit poor people in poor countries. That fallacy will be examined in the discussion of the third world countries in Chapter 7. But first, poverty and inequality require separate analysis and careful definitions. Scare quotes, the rich, and scare quotes, the poor. Even such widely used terms as the rich and the poor are seldom defined and are often used in inconsistent ways. By the rich, for example, we usually mean people with large accumulations of wealth. But most statistics in discussions of the rich are not about accumulations of wealth, but are about the current flow of income during a given year. Similarly, the poor are usually defined in terms of current income, rather than in terms of how much wealth they have or have not accumulated. Income and wealth are not only different in concept, they are very different in terms of who has how much of each. Among the people with low incomes who are not poor are the following. 1. Wives of affluent or rich men, and husbands of affluent or rich women. 2. Affluent or wealthy speculators, investors, and business owners whose enterprises are having an off year and may even be losing money in a given year. 3. People who graduate in the middle of the year from high schools, colleges, or postgraduate institutions, and who therefore earn only 1/2 or less of what they will be earning the following year. 4. Doctors, dentists, and other independent professionals who are just beginning their careers and who have not yet built up a sufficient clientele to pay office and other expenses, with enough left over to create an income at all comparable to what they will be making in a few years. 5. Young adults still living in the homes of affluent or wealthy parents, rent-free, or living elsewhere at their parents' expense, while they explore their possibilities, work sporadically, or in low-paid entry-level jobs, or as volunteers in philanthropic or political enterprises. 6. Retirees who have no rent to pay or mortgage payments to make because they own their own homes and who have larger assets in general than younger people have, even if the retiree's current income is low. None of these is what most people have in mind when they speak of the poor. But statistics do not distinguish between people whose current incomes are low and people who are genuinely poor in the sense that they are an enduring class of people whose standards of living will remain low for many years, or even for life, because they lack either the income or the wealth to live any better. Similarly, most of the people whose current incomes are in the top 10 or 20% are not rich in the sense of being people who have been in top income and wealth brackets most of their lives. Most income statistics present a snapshot picture as of a given moment, and their results are radically different from those statistics which follow the same given individuals over a period of years. For example, 3/4 of those Americans whose incomes were in the bottom 20% in 1975 were also in the top 40% at some point during the next 16 years. In other words, a large majority of those people who would be considered poor on the basis of current incomes as of a given year later rise into the top half of the income recipients in the country. Nor is this pattern peculiar to the United States. A study in Britain followed thousands of individuals for 6 years and found that, at the end of that period, nearly two-thirds of those individuals whose incomes were initially in the bottom 10% had risen out of that bracket. Other studies showed that 1/2 of the people in Greece and 2/3 of the people in Holland who were below the poverty line in a given year had risen above that line within 2 years. Studies in Canada and New Zealand showed similar results. Studies which followed specific individuals over a period of years must not be confused with statistics on incomes in society as a whole over a period of years, or even statistics on particular income brackets over a period of years. The crucial difference is that most people move from one income bracket to another as the years goes on. That makes it completely misleading to say, for example, that, quote, people making minimum wages have waited 10 long years for a raise, end quote, because these are not the same people making the same wages for 10 years, even when the minimum wage level has not been changed in a decade. Far from being an enduring class, most Americans in the bottom 10 or 20% of income earners are transients in those brackets, as are people in other income brackets. Just as many people move up from the lowest income brackets, so some other people move down into those brackets, even if only temporarily, due to unprofitable years for their particular businesses or professions. Given the transience of individuals in low-income brackets, it becomes easier to understand such anomalies, as hundreds of thousands of families with annual incomes below $20,000 living in homes worth $300,000 or more. In addition to such exceptional people, the average person in the lowest fifth in income spends twice as much money annually as his or her annual income. Clearly, there must be some supplementary source of purchasing power, whether savings from previous and more prosperous years, credit based on past income and future prospects, unreported illegal income, or money supplied by a spouse, parents, the government, or other benefactors. Despite many depictions of the elderly as people struggling to get by, households headed by people aged 70 to 74 have the highest average wealth of any age bracket in American society. While the average income of households headed by someone 65 years or older is less than half that of households headed by somebody 35 to 44 years old, the average wealth of these older households is nearly 3 times the wealth of households headed by people in the 35 to 44-year-old bracket, and more than 15 times the wealth of households headed by people under 35 years of age. Of the income of people 65 and older, only 24% comes from earnings, while 57% comes from Social Security or other pensions. This means that quote-unquote income distribution, statistics based on earnings, grossly understate the incomes of the elderly, which are 4 times as high as their earnings. This does not even count the money available to elderly homeowners by tapping the equity in their homes with reverse mortgages. The money received by borrowing against the equity in their homes is not counted as income, since these are loans to be repaid posthumously by their estates. But the economic reality is that money available by transferring home equity into a current flow of dollars serves the same purposes as income, even if it is not counted in income statistics. Many of the elderly who may be statistically poor, based on earnings, are far from poor otherwise. 80% of people 65 and older are either homeowners or home buyers. Of these 80%, their median monthly household housing costs in 2001 averaged just $339. That includes property taxes, utilities, maintenance costs, condominium and association costs for people with such living arrangements, and mortgage payments for those who do not own their homes outright. 85% of their homes have air conditioning. Not only are housing costs lower in these age brackets, retirees, of course, do not have the daily transportation and other costs of going to and from work. The elderly tend to have higher medical costs, but the net cost to them depends on the nature of their medical insurance coverage, including Medicare. Whatever their net costs of living, their economic situation compared to younger groups cannot be determined simply by comparing their average earnings or even average incomes. If the poor are ill-defined by statistics on current income, so are the rich. Seldom is any specific amount of money, whether as wealth or even income, used to define who is rich. Most often, some percentage level, the top 10 or 20%, for example, is used to label people as rich. Moreover, laws to raise taxes on the rich are almost invariably laws to raise the taxes on particular income brackets without touching accumulations of wealth. But the incomes of those who are declared to be rich by politicians or in the media are usually far below what most people would consider rich. For example, as of 2001, a household income of $84,000 was enough to put those who earned it in the top 20% of Americans. A couple making $42,000 each is hardly what most people would consider rich. Even to make the top 5% required a household income of just over $150,000. That is, about $75,000 apiece for a working couple. As for individuals, to reach the top 10% in individual income required an income of $87,300 in 2004. These are comfortable incomes, but hardly the kinds of incomes that would enable people to live in Beverly Hills or to own a yacht or a private plane. The different ages of people in different income brackets, with the highest average incomes being among people 45 to 54 years old, strongly suggests that most of the people in upper income brackets have reached that level only after having risen from lower income levels over the course of many years. In other words, they are no more of a lifetime class than are the poor. Despite heady rhetoric about economic disparities between classes, most of those economic differences reflect the mundane fact that most people start out in lower-paid, entry-level jobs and then earn more as they acquire more skills and experience over the years. They are transients in particular income brackets, rather than an enduring class of either rich or poor, so the same people often receive each label at different times of their lives. There are various ways of measuring income inequality, but a more fundamental distinction is between inequality at a given time, however that might be measured, and inequality over a lifetime, which is what is implied in discussions of classes of the rich and the poor, or the haves and have-nots. Given the widespread movement of individuals from one income level to another in the course of a lifetime, it is hardly surprising that lifetime inequality is less than inequality as measured at a given time. Moreover, interns are well aware that they are on their way to becoming doctors, as people in other entry-level jobs do not expect to stay at that level for life. Yet measurements of income inequality as of a given time are what dominate discussions of income quote-unquote disparities or quote-unquote inequities in the media, in politics, and in academia. Moreover, a succession of such measurements of inequality in the population as a whole over a period of years still misses the progression of individuals to higher income brackets over time. To say that the bottom 20% of households are, quote, falling further behind, end quote, those in the upper income brackets, as is often said in the media, in politics, and among the intelligentsia, is not to say that any given flesh and blood individuals are falling further behind, since most of the people in the bottom 20% move ahead over time to rise into higher income brackets. Moreover, even when an abstract statistical category is falling behind other abstract statistical categories, that does not necessarily represent a declining real per capita income, even among those people transiently within that category. The fact that the share of the bottom 20% of households declined from 4% of all income in 1985 to 3.5% in 2001 did not prevent the real income of the households in these brackets from rising, quite aside from the movement of actual people out of the bottom 20% between the 2 years. The quote-unquote vanishing middle class. One of the perennial alarms based on income statistics is that the American middle class is declining in size, presumably leaving only the small group of the rich and the masses of the poor. But what has in fact been happening to the middle class? One of the simplest statistical illusions has been created by defining the middle class by some fixed interval of income, such as between $35,000 and $50,000, and then counting how many people are in that interval over the years. If the interval chosen is in the middle of a statistical distribution of incomes, that may be a valid definition, so long as the midpoint in that distribution of incomes does not change. But as already noted, American incomes have been rising over the years, despite strenuous statistical efforts to make incomes seem to be stagnating. As the statistical distribution of incomes shifts to the right over the years, and this is where we'll be inserting our visual representations, the number of people in the income range originally in the center of that distribution declines. In other words, the number of middle-class people declines when there is a fixed definition of middle class in a country with rising levels of income. The simple situation illustrated in these graphs, a general rise in incomes, has generated large and recurring waves of journalistic and political rhetoric deploring an ominous shrinking of the middle class, implicitly defined as a reduction in the numbers of people between the income levels represented by perpendicular lines A and B on these graphs. Let this graph illustrate the initial distribution of income, with incomes between line A and line B being defined as middle class incomes. Then let the graph below illustrate an increase in median income. The fact that there are now fewer people within the fixed income brackets between A and B that previously defined the middle class does not mean that the middle class is disappearing when the median income increases. Despite the simplicity of this fallacy, people who should know better, and perhaps do know better, have been depicting this reduction in the number of people within fixed income brackets as something dire. Economist Paul Krugman, for example, has said, quote, "By almost any measure, the middle class is smaller now than it was in 1973. There is now a pervasive sense that the American dream has gone astray, that children can expect to live worse than their parents." End quote. The insinuation is that the statistical distribution of incomes has shifted to the left, when in fact all the evidence shows that it has shifted to the right. For example, over the decades, the percentage of American families with incomes over $75,000 has tripled. Yet Professor Krugman was by no means alone in his depiction of a shrinking middle class. The same theme has been echoed over the years in such prominent publications as the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Atlantic magazine. Executives' pay. The high pay of corporate executives in general, and of chief executive officers in particular, has attracted much popular media and political attention, much more so than the similar or higher pay of professional athletes, movie stars, media celebrities, and others in very high income brackets. While the top 10 corporate executives earned an average of $59 million in 2004, the top 10 celebrities earned an average of $119 million each that same year, twice as much. Yet it is rare, almost unheard of, to hear criticisms of the incomes of sports, movie, or media stars, much less hear heated denunciations of them for, quote-unquote, greed. One of the most popular and most fallacious explanations of the very high salaries of corporate executives is greed. But when your salary depends on what other people are willing to pay you, you can be the greediest person on earth, and that will not raise your pay by one dime. Any serious explanation of corporate executive salaries must be based on the reasons for those salaries being offered, not the reasons why recipients desired them. Anybody can desire anything, but that will not cause others to meet those desires. Why then do corporations go so high in their bidding for top executive talent? Supply and demand is probably the quickest short answer, And any fuller answer would probably require the kind of highly specific knowledge and experience of those corporate officials who make the decisions as to whom to hire and how much pay to offer. Given the billions of dollars at stake in corporate decisions, $59 million a year can be a bargain for someone who can reduce mistakes by 10% and thereby save the corporation $100 million. Some have argued that corporate boards of directors have been overly generous with the stockholders' money, and that this explains the high pay of corporate CEOs. To substantiate this as a general explanation would require more than a few specific examples. This theory could be tested as a general explanation by comparing the pay of CEOs in corporations owned by a large number of stockholders, most of whom are in no position to keep abreast of, much less evaluate, decisions made within those corporations, versus the pay of CEOs of corporations owned and controlled by a few huge financial institutions with both expertise and experience and spending their own money. It is precisely these latter corporations which offer the highest pay for all for chief executive officers. These giant financial institutions do not have to justify their decisions to public opinion, but can base these decisions on far greater specific knowledge and professional experience than that of the public, the media, or politicians. They are the least likely to pay more than they have to, or to be penny wise and pound foolish when choosing someone to run a business where many billions of dollars of their own money are at stake. Although many outsiders have expressed incredulity and non-comprehension at the vast sums of money paid to various people in the corporate world, there is no reason why those people should be expected to comprehend why A pays B any given sum of money for services rendered. Those services are not rendered to third-party observers, most of whom have neither the expertise nor the specific experience required to put a value on such services. Still less is there any reason why they should have a veto over the decisions of those who do have the expertise and experience to assess the value of the services rendered. For example, the director of the company that publishes the Washington Post assessed the recommendations of one member of his board of directors this way. Quote, Mr. Buffett's recommendations to management have been worth, no question, billions. End quote. It is very doubtful whether Mr. Buffett's compensation from the Washington Post company alone runs into billions of dollars, but it may well run into enough millions to cause third-party onlookers to exclaim their incredulity and perhaps moral outrage. The source of moral outrage over corporate compensation is by no means obvious. If it is based on a belief that individuals are overpaid for their contribution to the corporation, then there would be even more outrage toward people who received hundreds of millions of dollars for doing nothing at all, since they simply inherited money. Yet inheritors of fortunes are seldom resented, much less denounced, the way corporate CEOs are. 3 heirs to the Rockefeller fortune, for example, have been elected as popular governors of 3 states. 2 things seem especially to anger critics of high corporate executive salaries. 1. The belief that their high compensation comes at the expense of consumers, stockholders, and/or employees. And 2. The multi-million-dollar severance pay package often given to executives who have clearly failed. But like anybody who is hired anywhere, whether in a high or low position, a corporate CEO is hired precisely because the benefits that CEO is expected to confer on the employer exceed what the employer offers to pay. If, for example, a $50 million a year CEO saves the corporation $100 million as expected, then the stockholders have lost nothing and are in fact better off by $41 million. Neither have the consumers nor the employees lost anything. Like most economic transactions, the hiring of a corporate CEO is not a zero-sum transaction. It is intended to make both parties better off. It would be immediately obvious why the zero-sum view is wrong if someone suggested that money paid to George C. Scott for playing in the movie Patton was a loss to stockholders, moviegoers, or to lower-level employees who performed simple tasks during the making of the movie. Only if we believe that Patton would have made just as much money without George C. Scott can his pay be regarded as a deduction from the money otherwise available to stockholders, moviegoers, and other people employed making the movie. Much has been made of the fact that corporate executives make many times the pay of ordinary workers under them, the number varying according to who is making the claim, but no one would bother to figure out how many times larger George C. Scott's pay was than that of movie extras or people who handled lights or carried film during the production of Patton. The most puzzling and most galling aspect of corporate executives' compensation for many people are the multi-million-dollar severance payments, the quote-unquote golden parachutes, paid to CEOs who are clearly being gotten rid of because they failed. Since human beings are going to make mistakes, whether hiring an entry-level, unskilled employee or a corporate CEO, the question is, what options are available when it becomes clear that the CEO is a failure and a liability? Speed may be the most important consideration when someone is making decisions which may be losing millions or even billions of dollars. Getting that CEO out the door as soon as possible, without either internal battles within the corporation or lawsuits in the courts, may be well worth millions of dollars. This is not a unique situation, even if the sums of money involved are larger in a multi-billion-dollar corporation than in other situations that people are more familiar with. Aging university professors, who have not kept up with recent developments in their field, may be offered a lucrative early retirement package in order to replace such professors with people who have mastered the latest advances. Similarly, many a married person has paid very substantial sums of money to get a divorce, perhaps larger in proportion to income compared to what a corporation pays to bring a bad relationship to an end. In this and other situations, putting an end to a relationship may be just as valuable, or even more valuable, than the initial beginning of the relationship once seemed. As with the original hiring decision, neither stockholders nor consumers nor other employees are worse off for the payment of a large severance package. If that cuts losses that would be even bigger if the failed CEO stayed on. Nor need the original hiring decision have been mistaken when it was made. Times change and individuals change over the years, so that a CEO who was perfect for the circumstances that existed at the time of hiring may be out of touch with very different conditions that evolve in later years. When Sewell Avery was head of U.S. Gypsum from 1905 to 1931, and then head of the Montgomery Ward retail store chain after 1931, he was regarded as one of the premier business leaders in the country. However, during his later years, when conditions in retailing became quite different, there were complaints about his leadership of Montgomery Ward and bitter internal struggles to try to get rid of him. When he finally left, the value of Montgomery Ward stock shot up immediately. It might well have been a bargain for the stockholders, the customers, and the employees to have paid Avery enough to get him to leave earlier, since a badly run company hurts all of these people. Third-party observers may find it galling that some people seem to be rewarded handsomely for failing. But third parties are neither paying their money, nor are in a position to know how much it is worth to be rid of someone. When an individual pays dearly to divorce a spouse who is impossible to live with, that too might be seen as rewarding failure. But does any third party presume to say that the decision to divorce was wrong, much less feel entitled to be morally outraged or to call on government to stop such things? Social mobility. We have already noted one kind of economic and social mobility, the movement of people out of the lowest income brackets in the course of their own working lifetime. A major study at the University of Michigan has followed the same individuals, tens of thousands of them, over a period of decades. Among individuals who are actively in the labor force, only 5% of those who were in the bottom 20% in income in 1975 were still there in 1991, compared to 29% of those in the bottom quintile in 1975 who had risen to the top quintile by 1991. More than half of those in the bottom quintile in 1975 had been in the top quintile at some point during these years. However, as we have also seen, not everyone is working, especially in the lowest income brackets. The rise of those who are working indicates what opportunities there are. How many people take advantage of those opportunities is another question. There's another kind of socioeconomic mobility that many have written about: the extent to which people born in low-income families rise to higher income or occupational levels than those of their parents. Here, a number of things get confused with one another, including the amount of opportunity available versus the amount of opportunity used. Much discussion of social mobility is based on the concept of quote-unquote life chances, the likelihood that someone born into given socioeconomic circumstances will grow up to achieve some given economic or occupational level. Sometimes causation is confused with blame, as when any attempt to point out factors in any social group which inhibit their progress is called quote-unquote blaming the victim, presumably the victim of society. Many factors, however, involve no blame and may be due to neither the individual nor to society, but to circumstances. For example, someone born deaf is unlikely to become a musician, even though Beethoven continued to write music after losing his hearing. Physical or mental handicaps beyond the individual's control may reduce the likelihood of utilizing various opportunities that are otherwise available in a given society. Cultural values, inherited socially rather than biologically, may also reduce the statistical probability of advancing in income or occupations, even when the opportunity to do so is available, and no given individual chooses which culture to be born into. Even sophisticated statistical analyses of probabilities of people from various groups achieving various income or occupational levels often equate low probabilities with high barriers created by others. A child raised in a home where physical prowess is valued more than intellectual prowess is unlikely to have the same goals and priorities as a child raised in a home where the reverse is true. Some have seen such circumstances as examples of barriers and privileges. For example, a New York Times article that said it is harder to move up from one economic class to another, end quote, and that this was due to a new kind of privilege. Quote, merit has replaced the old system of inherited privilege, in which parents on the matter and to the manner born handed down to the manner, Quote, merit has replaced the old system of inherited privilege, in which parents to the manner born handed down the manner to their children. But merit, it turns out, is at least partly class-based. Parents with money, education, and connections cultivate in their children the habits that the meritocracy rewards. When their children then succeed, their success is seen as earned, end quote. In a similar vein, the head of the Russell Sage Foundation conceded that the, quote, old system of hereditary barriers and clubby barriers has pretty much vanished, end quote, but regarded these barriers as now being replaced by, quote, new ways of transmitting advantage, end quote. Failure to make a distinction between external impediments to individual advancements and internal differences in individual orientation makes attempts to determine or measure empirically the opportunities available an exercise in futility or confusion. For example, when a study shows that only 32% of sons of fathers in the bottom quarter of income earners reached the top half of income earners by their early 30s, that statistic tells us nothing about whether this was due to external barriers or internal orientations. Moreover, statistics from this widely reported study arbitrarily omit any upward mobility that occurs to males after their 30s, all upward mobility by women, and any movement upward that does not get as far as the top half. What purpose this serves is open to speculation. To the extent that blaming society is more or less the default setting for explaining differences in social mobility among income classes, ethnic groups, or among other segments of society, This itself shifts attention away from internal factors which inhibit many individuals from using opportunities that are available. By reducing awareness of such internal impediments to advancement, this approach reduces the chances of changes in such internal impediments and thereby reduces the very chances for lower income people to advance that these studies claim to be concerned about. All right, that concludes today's read. Now on to the analysis and review part of the video. All right, welcome to the analysis and review part of the video. So this was an incredibly long read. So since there's so much to unpack there, we're going to largely look at this from a 30,000-foot perspective and just talk broadly about the points that he's making and some of the things that he said that probably need a little bit more extrapolation to understand a little bit better. So before we start, sometimes my analysis and review is largely focused on review and less so focused on analysis. I'm going to open up with a little bit of a review. This read is why people, including me, love Soul. If we could easily label this video Soul Destroys, one of these Soul Destroys videos, because in this read, he debunks thoroughly just endless myth after myth after myth. It's just nonstop fallacies tackled and debunked. And the other reason that people love his style of reading is because not only does he debunk these fallacies just as part of like a lightning round, he does so with absolute tenacity, and he does so in so simplistic and brilliant a manner that it becomes deeply satisfying to see these arguments that he's presenting, the debunking arguments, put to paper, to have the pen put to paper, as the proverb goes. So I actually found myself, when I first started reading this section, laughing throughout a lot of this. And this isn't because I'm laughing at his arguments, but what I'm laughing at is, again, that simplicity, that brilliance with which he debunks all of these arguments. We can start, of course, with how he debunks basically the zero-sum fallacy that he talked about at the beginning of this read, which is on page 34. But this is, excuse me, when I say I was laughing, I'm not laughing at the simplicity of his arguments. I'm laughing at basically the arguments that he's debunking, because he debunks them so thoroughly and so simplistic, with so brilliant and simplistic and straightforward an argument, that it makes the other arguments just seem comical. So again, he does this, I think, an example of what he's doing here is on page 34 when he debunks the zero-sum fallacy. But this is just one of the many forms of the zero-sum fallacy. Since the United States contains several times as many billionaires as any other country, ordinary Americans would be among the most poverty-stricken people in the world if the wealth of the wealthy derives from the poverty of the poor. No kidding, folks. He does go on to explain what the proverbial left or the opposition would respond with in the sentence immediately after, in the sentences immediately following that. So he knows that people are going to say, oh, well, they're exploiting labor in other countries. And his debunking of that is again, straightforward, simple, concise, brilliant. And this is one of the fallacies that he talked about in the opening read in this book, the zero-sum fallacy, and that would be one of the major fallacies to focus on. I'll put a link in this video's description to where we did that part of the read in this book, so you guys can get a greater detail of his explanation of that fallacy and why it is just that, a fallacy. The other fallacy that he brought up in that read was the chess piece fallacy. In this case, as it's specific to this chapter read, basically the fallacy is that humans are not statistical categories. Humans are individuals. And that he explains this on page 142. Anybody can desire anything, but that will not cause, excuse me, hold on. I don't think I'm on the wrong. Okay. Yeah. So people are not statistical categories. I jumped the gun. Excuse me, folks. They when it comes to the income quintiles, people move throughout those income quintiles. So what you would need to do is not perform a study that is a snapshot, and not perform a study which is a focus on the quintiles, the statistical units. You'd need to do some sort of study on the individual, and you'd need to do it over a period of years to see how each of those individuals tracks throughout their lifetime. This is what's called a longitudinal study. So a longitudinal study would be something along the lines of, if you were looking at the long-term health consequences of marijuana, what you would actually want to do is take, say, 30,000 regular smokers of marijuana and compare and create some metric for, let's say we're talking about cognitive faculties. You'd create some test of cognitive faculties, say at age 21, and then you follow them throughout the course of the next 30 years, and you perform the test several times throughout the course of those 30 years. And then you do the same thing with a control group, people who never smoke any marijuana, say, for example, from the same age groups on. So you start off with, say, 1,000 people who, at the age of 21, 500 who smoke marijuana regularly, and 500 who don't. And then you track that throughout the course of their lifetimes and make sure that the 500 people who are smoking marijuana regularly at 21 are smoking marijuana regularly for the next 30 years. And then you have something to compare themselves to. This is what's called a longitudinal study. And you need to do that in this case, in this economic sense, because people bounce around throughout these categories. And just like in that marijuana example, the reason you would want to do a longitudinal study is so you can control for independent variables which may arise throughout the course of somebody's lifetime. For example, a cancer diagnosis that has nothing to do with the marijuana, like a lymphatic cancer diagnosis, like a cancer of the pancreas, which, as far as we can tell, has nothing to do with marijuana. And there might be some cancers that might have some causal link with, say, lung cancer, but there definitely isn't one when it comes to pancreatic cancer. So if somebody develops a pancreatic cancer or a skin cancer, in the meantime, obviously that's going to have some sort of impact on health consequences moving forward. If they develop brain cancer, and we're talking about cognitive faculties, we need to control for those independent variables. And that's kind of difficult to do if you've just got a snapshot of, say, people at 40 who have smoked marijuana for 20 years. What you really need to do is see how their cognitive faculties have improved, stay the same, or diminished over the years relative to the same people who otherwise were not smoking marijuana. Because if people who aren't smoking marijuana are seeing their cognitive faculties decline over the years, I'll do this for you guys, then what you would expect is for people who are smoking marijuana regularly, if there is no effect from marijuana, you'd expect their cognitive faculties to decline over the years. So for this reason, we need to do a longitudinal study. We can't just do a snapshot look. And he talks about this throughout the chapter, especially when he's referring to income mobility, which is what we talked about. People move within these brackets. There's two types of income mobility. There's horizontal and then vertical. The one that I'm not going to bore you to death with horizontal mobility, but there is such a thing as horizontal income mobility. It relates to, let's say you make $40,000 to do X, and there are other fringe benefits to the job that have nothing to do with income. Nearness to family, shortness of commute, availability to take time off on a moment's notice. If you horizontally shift from one job to another in the income bracket, it may improve your life. It may improve your life experiences. It may reduce your costs. For example, if you're doing a horizontal shift in income and just simply reducing an hour and a half long commute to a 5-minute commute, just by taking a job that's closer to home. If you do a horizontal shift to something that's closer to home, specifically so that you can have grandma take care of the kids instead of having to pump somebody into daycare, on the way to work, because you got to be at work at 6:30 in the morning, which means the kids have to be strapped in at 5 in the morning. Nothing opens until 6, so you're going to have to basically drop them off at a daycare center on the way to work. Whereas if you can do it at home, then you don't have to wake grandma up at whatever hour in the morning, and you can drop them off with grandma, let's say. So that's what's a horizontal shift in income, and that's a version of horizontal mobility. Most people don't really care about that, and that's why SOWELL doesn't really bring this up, because most of the pundits talk about vertical income mobility, the ability to go from one job at, say, $40,000 to another job at, say, $45,000 or $55,000. etc. So he basically makes these cases in regards to income mobility, starting on pages 145. A major study at the University of Michigan has followed the same individuals, tens of thousands of them, over a period of decades. That's our longitudinal study. Among individuals who are actively in the labor force, only 5% of those who were in the bottom 20%, the bottom quintile, in income in 1975 were still there in 1991, compared to 29% of those in the bottom quintile in 1975 who had risen to the top quintile by 1991. So this implies, and this kind of debunks the notion that there isn't any income mobility in the United States, and that the income quintiles are largely a reflection of where you are in your career. If you're 19 and you're getting your first job ever, you're probably not going to make as much as you, the individual, same person would make at age 38 when you have 19 years of experience in your field. A resume that's got 19 years worth of working experience on it. And that's not just relative, and that's not just a reflection of inflation, because you don't go from the second quintile to the fourth quintile as a reflection of inflation, because these quintiles are a percentage of income earners. So you don't leave these quintiles unless you've already controlled for inflation. He then talks about the motivating factors for why it is people fit into certain income brackets, and he talks about greed. And to me, this is just an extension of Sowell's ability to debunk a fallacy extremely well. And part of the whole read being, one of these SOWELL Destroy reads, and is one of my favorite reads in this book personally, and why a lot of people I think actually like Sowell in general. So this is an example of that, and that's on page 142 when he starts to debunk the notion of greed. Anybody can desire anything, but that will not cause others to meet those desires. When then do corporations go so high in their bidding for top executive talent? Supply and demand is probably the quickest short answer, and any fuller answer would probably require the kind of highly specific knowledge and experience of those corporate officials who make the decisions as to whom to hire and how much pay to offer. So you could be the greediest person on earth, but what actually matters when we're talking about income levels is why somebody is willing to pay somebody that amount. Is it because they're greedy? Or is it because it's going to serve their interest to give that person that pay rate because they think they're getting more bang for their buck? And I mean, we're going to get into the greater lesson here, but he goes on page 143. But like anybody who is hired anywhere, whether in a high or low position, a corporate CEO is hired precisely because the benefits that CEO is expected to confer on the employer exceeds what the employer offers to pay. There's a second concept brought into that read. We'll get into in a second. Like most economic transactions, the hiring of a corporate CEO is not a zero-sum transaction. It is intended to make both parties better off. And you can see where I'm going with this, that this is just a simple extrapolation, a simple extension of Smith's lesson that we've talked about throughout the course of both this read and our parallel read and Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson, that we've absolutely beaten to death. That the reason CEOs make as much as they make isn't because of their greed. It's because they are functioning in a competitive market. And functioning in a competitive market is an element of the human condition. It's not that humans are greedy. It's that when competing for scarce resources, having the greatest amount of medium of exchange, greatest access to the medium of exchange, is going to allow you to better compete for those scarce resources. And an extension of that is the business perspective. The corporation isn't going to hire the CEO for $59 million unless the corporation thinks they're getting way more than $59 million in value in return. And when a CEO of a major, huge company like Microsoft or Google or Amazon, when they make a screw up, but let's say when you make a screw up at your job, how much does that cost your company? For me, if I'm in a landscaping company and if I make a major screw up, what's a major screw up for me? I crash a truck? Well, insurance covers most of those costs, but there are certain costs involved in crashing a truck that you can't really make up for. For example, the lost labor, the lost capital, the lost potential, the lost opportunity. There's a huge opportunity cost of having that happen, the reputational costs that might incur. But you're probably not going to utterly destroy most landscaping companies by crashing a truck. That said, I'm probably fired. But what we're going to amount to in terms of potential cost basis is what, a few $100,000 at the absolute most? If CEOs of these $100 billion hedge funds even fart in the wrong direction, it's going to cost those companies billions of dollars. So minor mistakes at that level cost the companies billions of dollars. So because of that, there is an incredibly competitive market for that labor. What does that mean? That means that when you have an incredibly competitive market for the thing, consumers of the thing are willing to pay a dearly for the thing. If you're in the Sahara and there is some oasis in the desert and you've got these competing factions of tribes, thousands of years ago, let's say, they are willing to pay a colossal bloody cost. And I say bloody, not in the English, in the UK sense. I mean, they will pay dearly in blood for that water. We have an incredibly competitive market for the thing. So in this case, the CEO makes as much as he does, not because the CEO is greedy, but because the CEO is functioning in a competitive market where the buyer is willing to pay that much for their expertise. And as I mentioned, this is just an extension of Smith's lesson. What the company is functioning on a voluntary basis, and so is the employer in this case, the employee in this case, the CEO. What is good, it is axiomatically and obviously and self-evidently true that the hiring of that person at that price point is seen as, at the moment at least, at the moment of hire at least, providing benefit to both parties. And as a result, everybody wins. And he goes further on to explain that, again, on page 143. It would be immediately obvious why zero-sum view is wrong if someone suggested that money paid to George C. Scott for playing in the movie Patton was a loss to stockholders, moviegoers, or to lower-level employees who performed simple tasks during the making of the movie. Yeah, so we hear all these complaints about CEOs and the corporations, but you won't hear the same thing about athletes who make zillions and zillions of dollars to play in the NFL, and, the ball boys who make, $25,000 a year to hand out the balls, or to the grips who hold microphones and lights if you need a grip to hold a light. On a movie set where you're paid, $1,000 for your 2 weeks worth of service as a grip versus, Brad Pitt in Fight Club, Brad Pitt in Fight Club was commanding millions of dollars a movie. I'm going to actually link to a video I made about there's a politician in my area who was running for office who wanted the CEO of the electrical company that is supplying electricity to residents in the state and is the only one doing it, and who serves, therefore, millions of customers in this state alone, is a multinational firm and which has billions of dollars in both revenue and expenses. And his implication was that he wanted to cap the salary of the CEO for that company at something like $150,000. It was an absolute pittance compared to what the CEO, of course, at the time was making, and these frustrations. And I explained in that video that you are utterly delusional if you think you're going to find somebody even remotely qualified to run a multi-billion-dollar firm like that one that has a colossal regulatory barriers to overcome, despite being given basically a government-endorsed monopoly, a functional government-enforced monopoly over the supply of electricity to residents in Connecticut. So I'll link to that because that kind of extrapolates this idea in greater detail. And I want to talk about one quick aside here before we wrap things up. Sowell talked at great length about the pain in the ass firing. That's firing a CEO. So a CEO who makes these multi-billion-dollar mistakes that you just got to get rid of. Cut your losses, you got to get rid of them. Spending a few bucks to get rid of that guy might be worth it. Now remember, a lot of these contracts that CEOs are under, because none of them are hired at will. They're all hired by contract. Let's be honest. The ones that make $10 million or more a year, they're all hired under contract. They're not employed at will. Those contracts almost certainly are going to include some sort of stipulation of not only the term of the contract, not only the service of the contract, but how to exit that contract. So if you need to just shred up a contract, if you just shred up the contract and say goodbye, you're in court for a long time. At the very least, you're going to be in court for a long time, and it's going to cost you oodles. Or you briefcase the CEO, basically, a whole bunch of money, and you get out of the courtroom and you get a new CEO in place. So not only do you not incur the costs in the courtroom, you don't have to incur the opportunity costs of basically being at the end of a gun barrel, keeping the crappy CEO employed when you can bring on a new CEO who might make you so much more money that you're making up for the loss of just, here's your severance package, get out of here and don't sue us. So in addition to that, there may be some other frustrations, even if they're hired at will, which they're not. None of them are. But even if they were hired at will, there may almost certainly be somebody who's getting paid tens of millions of dollars a year, has millions of dollars a year, to be an obstinate jerk. And if they're going to be an obstinate jerk when it comes time to, separate, then what you do is you pay them to not be an obstinate jerk. And if the terms of your severance include things like you can't go onto social media and be a prick about our company, then what you have is you can bring them to court if they decide to be an obstinate jerk. So in that case, this happens at these multinational firms, and it also happens even at the lower level. And I'll give you the perfect example of that. My family owns a small hardware store in town. Single location, small hardware store. We don't do a lot of money. In fact, we're losing our shirts right now. There is a person who was a very minority shareholder in the company. Part of his compensation over the years was that he was getting small minority shares. And that guy, when it came to making grander decisions, I won't say he got in the way. I won't say he was an obstacle. He was not an obstinate prick, but he could have been. And we didn't know if he was going to be that obstinate prick. So there were discussions about just buying out his shares. In that case, it would effectively be the same thing as basically firing somebody and offering them a severance to say, please go away. We need to make certain decisions you're not going to agree with, but we need to make those decisions. So here's a whole bunch of money to go away. And everybody knows about this. There's, whenever any court case is brought to the fore, there's always going to be the option in civil court to pay a whole bunch of money to somebody to go away, make this disappear. This is true, as Sowell points out, in domestic disputes when you have a divorce. This is true in any civil case that is settled out of court for a settlement. This is the fee to just have your hands washed of this. In this case, it's basically the price of convenience. So I just wanted to share that little bit of an anecdote before we wrapped everything up. There was kind of a lot to read in there. That's part of why this explanation's gone a little bit long. I didn't want to nitpick every little point in there, and there may be some points to nitpick in there. I just wanted to give you guys the 30,000-foot view. Otherwise, the review and analysis part of the video would be like an hour long. So hopefully that has helped to explain everything that went on in that read. We will continue in this series with Thomas Sowell's Economic Facts and Fallacies with our third and final read in Chapter 5. And that third and final read will be in the section, while I open up that section entitled Summary and Conclusions. So until then, it's been Mike, signing off.